Yes, you read the title correctly. Doctor Doom is being spotted in old Marvel movies, and we may finally have an explanation for why he's going to be the main villain of the Avengers, and why he will look like Tony Stark. Initially, the main theory people were discussing, and the most obvious one, was that Doctor Doom from another universe just happens to look like Tony Stark. I mean, that would have been the easiest thing for Marvel to do, and honestly, no one would have complained about it. We've already seen this kind of thing in the MCU, more specifically in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, where they introduced Sinister Strange. Basically an evil version of Doctor Strange who looked exactly like him from another universe. So making a Doom from another universe who simply looks like Tony Stark was definitely a plausible option. But it's also true that in the MCU, even most variants of the same character from other universes don't always look alike. Just look at the Peter Parker variants or the Loki variants. Not to mention that Sinister Strange looked like Doctor Strange because he was a Doctor Strange variant, not some random guy who simply looked like him. So if they went this route, although plausible, it would definitely be a really big coincidence. Fortunately, then a much more interesting theory came up, one that says Doom looks like Tony because he used the Dreamwalk on him. For those of you who don't remember, the Dreamwalk is the technique Strange and Wanda used in Multiverse of Madness, where they projected their consciousness into another version of themselves in another universe. And the fact that Tony is dead does not prevent this technique from being used, as we saw in Multiverse of Madness. We can't forget that Strange used that same magic on a dead body, specifically an alternate version of himself from another universe. The only requirement for this technique to work is that one can only use the Dreamwalk on a variant of himself. And this actually aligns perfectly with the recent news that said Doom is going to wear a mask because his face is disfigured. We all saw how Tony ended up in Endgame after he snapped. There's just one small flaw in this theory. If Doom is possessing Tony, meaning the real Doom is controlling his body, then technically another actor could be playing the real Doom behind the scenes. But as far as we know, RDJ is the only one set to play Doom. That's why I truly believe Marvel probably isn't going to use either of the two options I mentioned earlier, because now there's a third possibility. And without a doubt, it's much better and way more shocking than both of them. This third theory suggests that we've already seen Doom in the MCU, and he's none other than past Tony Stark, the one we saw in Endgame from the Battle of New York. I know that sounds crazy, but bear with me. When the Avengers traveled back in time in Endgame to 2012, back to where it all began, the older Avengers encountered their younger versions. And as expected, the events we knew from the original Avengers movie were heavily interfered with. And one of the characters who clearly suffered the most from these interferences was the Tony from the past. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is basically the idea that tiny, seemingly insignificant changes can trigger a chain of events that leads to large, unpredictable outcomes later on. In this timeline, Tony scratched his beard because of Ant-Man. This was something that didn't happen in the original timeline. After that, again thanks to Ant-Man, he had a heart problem because he made his reactor fail. These small changes in the original events probably had huge consequences in that timeline. And I'm only talking about what happened with Tony. Because let's not forget that the Captain America from the future and the one from the past also encountered each other. And maybe the most important change of all was Loki escaping with the Tesseract. And this is where this theory starts to come alive. Because that moment not only gave birth to the Loki series and all the events we saw there, but it could have also made Tony obsessed with going after the Space Stone, and especially after Loki. Because after everything he went through because of Loki in the first Avengers movie, there's no way he would rest until that villain was caught. We know how traumatized Tony was after the events of the Avengers. That was the major trigger that led him to think about creating a suit of armor around the world. And since no one really saw what happened with Loki after he disappeared, the first thing Tony would obviously do to figure it out would be to check the security footage. But when he checks that footage, he wouldn't just see how Loki escaped. He would also see the meeting between the two Captain Americas. And if that wasn't strange enough already, he'd hear the future Cap say that Bucky was alive and whisper, "Hail Hydra." So now, in Tony's mind, not only are there Hydra agents inside S.H.I.E.L.D., but even Captain America might be one of them. At that point, how could Tony trust anyone? It's not hard to imagine Tony becoming more and more paranoid, right? Right now, he can't even trust Cap. And after everything he just witnessed, the same way he used the security cameras of his tower, he would very likely also use the security cameras in New York to try to find out where they might have gone. And here, things get worse again, because by doing this, he would come across an extra Hulk and a second Tony Stark. However, Tony and Captain America disappeared from that timeline and went to 1970. This means the only one who stayed longer in that timeline was Professor Hulk. And if I remember correctly, when Professor Hulk went to 2012, he went to see the Ancient One at the Sanctum Sanctorum. This means it's very likely that Tony also went to the Ancient One's sanctuary to understand what Hulk went there to do. And that would have been the first time he had contact with the mystical arts, aka Earth's magic. Right here's another big change. Tony in the original timeline only learned about the existence of the mystical arts in Infinity War. The 2012 Tony was still very far from even meeting Doctor Strange. In this way, he discovered magic in the 2012 timeline would surely make him even more paranoid, especially after knowing that Hulk went there, because half of life in the future was going to be erased, including people close to him. This was precisely the type of thing that would make him go crazy, just like we saw in Age of Ultron. After the nightmare he had where every Avenger dies, it led him to the idea of a suit of armor around the world and consequently to give life to Ultron. Now imagine him knowing that happened for real and not in a dream. So it's very likely that after that, he went looking for the Ancient One and ended up wanting to start learning magic to be as prepared as possible for the future big threats he was possibly facing. It's not hard to believe that the Ancient One would accept him, since at first, he was actually a bit like Doctor Strange, arrogant, but with a good heart. And that's how a Tony Stark would be formed, who has very advanced technology and also knows how to use magic. And guess who else uses both technology and magic? Exactly, Dr. Doom. Unfortunately, Tony would become more of a Kaecilius than a Strange, because his paranoia would lead him to become so obsessed with learning magic at such a deep level. Because not only he knows half of life, and many of the close ones are going to be erased, he now can't even trust his allies. And so, over time, he might end up isolating himself, moving to a castle in Latveria. And the name changes would also make sense, because he was no longer the same person. He went so deep into a dark spiral that he no longer felt like himself. And these name changes would be a kind of symbolic rebirth. Now, apparently, there's a small flaw in this theory. It's the fact that the TVA erased that timeline where the Avengers traveled to 2012 after capturing Loki. At that time, according to TVA rules, there could only be one timeline. So, to prevent branching, they destroyed it. But in the Loki series, something happened that the TVA never expected to happen so overwhelmingly. The one timeline that existed started branching infinitely. And that moment is super crucial, because without it, this multiverse saga wouldn't even make sense. This moment gives rise to a new multiverse. And those infinite branches were why Loki had to sacrifice himself to save the multiverse. And since the branches were infinite, there's a high probability that the erased timeline came back to life, where all the events were exactly the same as what happened in the past in Endgame. And that would be brilliant, because the person who wanted to save the universe and the person who wants to destroy it came from the same moment. Now, this might not be what you want Marvel to do with Tony Stark, but you have to remember, Kang was supposed to be the main villain of this saga, not Doom. After everything that happened, they had to shift focus to Doom. This means they barely had time to prepare the ground for Doom. But despite that, still only introducing the main villain of what could be the biggest saga in the MCU only in the Avengers movie wouldn't be a great decision. That's why a lot of people are suspicious and believe in this theory, because this way, we would have already had contact with Doom in previous films, more specifically in Endgame. And he was right in front of our eyes the whole time. Look, if you're watching this video, it's because you're just as hyped as I am about Avengers Doomsday. And if the theory we just discussed turns out to be true, Dr. Doom is going to be the villain who will define the next decade of cinema. Now imagine having this epic figure of him in your collection, even before he's appeared on the big screen. It's that piece you'll look back on years from now and think, I already knew this guy was going to take over everything. And I'll be honest, at the moment I'm recording this, there are only 20 more figures left in stock. So, if you're thinking about starting or boosting your collection, don't waste time. If you want to take a look or add it to your collection, I left the link in the description. It's an affiliate link, which means that if you decide to buy, I get a small commission at no extra cost to you. And of course, you're directly helping the channel with that. So thank you in advance for that. With the short amount of time they have to prepare Doom for this saga, this would definitely be genius. However, if this isn't what Marvel is planning, I think they should pay attention to this fan theory and use it. We fans don't want the credits. We just want an amazing movie. But what about you? Which of the 3 theories I mentioned would you like to see used the most?